Welcome to the Normal Adolescent Nutrition Lecture. Today we're going to take a trip down memory lane and remember our teen years. So what do you need to know from this lecture? We want you to be able to understand and describe the physical and psychological changes that occur in adolescence. There are many, so up until now we've been just saying growth, 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 development, development, development. Puberty is a pretty unique time in life. So we're going to talk about how nutrition requirements are impacted, how dietary habits might change and what we typically see in adolescence. We're going to be able to describe the factors that often result in unhealthy eating and exercise behaviors. And then we're going to be able to apply what we know about normal adolescent development to tailor effective nutrition messages and programming for adolescents. This is a group that tends to be a little bit more difficult to reach, just of the variety of things that could be happening during this lifetime. So understanding how to communicate and motivate is really important. So let's do normal physical growth and development. And we're really talking about puberty. We're talking about adolescents and teenagers. So what are some of the biological changes that occur? Of course, sexual maturation is happening and certainly becoming very aware at this age. We know that there's a large growth spurt that's happening, so we see increases in both height and weight. We know that we're accumulating a great deal of skeletal mass and bone density during this time period. There's major changes in body composition, both fat mass and fat-free mass. An important point about this is the sequence of maturation events is consistent. So things happen in the same order, but there's great individual variations in age. So I've seen especially girls start puberty as early as age 8 or 9, and I have seen boys who don't go into their growth spurt till they're almost 18. Again, what happens in the same order, but when it starts and when it ends can vary considerably. Now we always should do this, but really do it during puberty, thinking about biological age and not chronological age. So not all 13-year-olds are created equal. And that's really important to think about when we're giving nutrition and health recommendations, is knowing where they are biologically or physiologically. That's what we need to use to assess growth and development and think about their nutritional needs. So here is one of the ways we figure out where someone is biologically or physiologically, and that is using the Tanner stages, or the sexual maturation rating. So whether you knew it or not, if you had a physical during your teen years, your pediatrician probably figured out what Tanner stage you were at. It's used to assess, where you are in puberty. Puberty takes many years to complete. So where are you within that range? And the top part, you're looking at female development, and the bottom half, you're looking at male development. And this is for sexual maturation. So we're focused on the sex organs that are influenced by hormones. So for a girl, puberty starts at Tanner age stage 2. If you're at stage 1, that's pre-puberty, so you haven't had any changes yet. Anywhere from 2 to 4 is where puberty is active, and by stage 5, you are complete and you're considered physiologically sexually mature. So really what we're ranking here is, 1 hasn't started, 5 is done. So where are we in 2, 3, and 4? So for girls, we look at breast development to figure out if you're 2, 3, or 4. We also look at pubic hair development. This is also some special notes. So it's talking about menarche, or when a girl will start getting her period. That's mostly happening around stage 4. Girls are having a growth spurt during this time. Generally, their growth is peaking around stage 3 or 4. And again, by stage 5, it is complete. A girl would be menstruating, would be able to become pregnant. For a boy, we're looking at penis and pubic hair. You can see the development between stages 2, 3, and 4, again with 5 being complete. The growth spurts for a boy is also happening around stages 3 and 4, and this is where boys and girls really start to separate, and the boys have a more rapid growth. They're ultimately on average going to be taller than females. So this is kind of make us think maybe back to pregnancy when we talked a lot about hormones and fertility. What mediates puberty? So what's driving it? Of course, it's hormonal changes. People always talk about hormones when they talk about puberty. And what kicks it off. So why do we start puberty? It is in fact the release of a hormone from the brain, specifically the hypothalamus, and that hormone is gonadotropin releasing hormone. So here we are, we're focused in on the pituitary gland, that really small gland on the base of the brain that is going to produce the gonadotropin releasing hormone. Now depending on if you're male or female, that's going to have different target hormones. So for males, again, we're really focused on the testes, and remember, sexual development involves making sperm that can be used to fertilize an egg and make someone become pregnant. For a girl, that target organ is going to be her ovaries. So she'll start producing hormones, including estrogen, that does allow those eggs to be released and able to be fertilized if they came into contact with sperm. That's also going to drive some of the other physical changes that we tend to see during puberty. The growth, so these are really more focused on the sexual changes. The growth, the changes in height and body composition are also coming from the pituitary, but they're more driven by growth hormone and another hormone called IGF-1. So if you think about what those target organs might be, liver, also that's going to stimulate more bone growth, which is how we get taller, and an increase in muscle, more so in boys than girls. So we've talked a little bit about growth velocity when we did pre-adolescence. For adolescents, we're talking about that last hurrah. We're really having our final major growth spurt. There's a difference here between boys and girls. So for girls, which is shown in the red, it tends to start and end earlier for girls than boys. For boys, it's a little bit more of a gradual increase in height, but even though it's more gradual, it lasts longer. For most adolescents, it's going to take 2 to 4 years for this growth spurt to take place. And at the end of it all, boys are on average about 10% taller than girls. Again, they start a little bit later, but it is a longer process. And you can see for most, by the age of 18, that growth spurt is complete and they've reached what will be their final adult height until they get into the elderly years, and then we actually shrink a little bit, but that's another story for another day. All right, so you're getting taller and your body composition is changing. So when I say body composition, I'm talking about what your body is made of, what it's composed of. So we know that we have body fat, which is important for stored energy. We also have everything that's not fat. And if you want to be more specific about what that fat-free mass is, that's going to include water, protein, and our bones and minerals. So let's start off with thinking about girls. During adolescence, girls absolutely gain fat mass. Boys, not nearly as much. So the major difference here is girls are preparing to reproduce if they do in fact get pregnant, and that does require more body fat mass. So if you can kind of see the differences in sort of these pre-puberty years, girls have about 20% body fat and 24 kilograms of fat-free mass. Boys will have a little less body fat, 15%, and their fat-free mass will be the same. But after puberty, we see a difference. Girls go from 20 to 26 body fat. Their fat-free mass almost doubles. Boys, if anything, actually have a little lower body fat. It drops during puberty, but they have a tremendous increase in fat-free mass, and even, of course, more so than a girl on average. So you'll notice down here I have interactions with a question mark. Keep in mind that these are averages and everyone is going to be different, and what happens with your body composition interacts with your exercise and diet. So certainly we have people who have more or less body fat, for example. And as you might guess, what that number ultimately ends up being has something to do with what you eat and how physically active and what you do for physical activity. Bone growth, I think, is very interesting in adolescence, because again, this is how we get taller. Our bones are growing. During childhood and adolescence, bones are sculpted by something we call modeling. So how do bones get bigger and specifically longer? How are they growing? And how are they doing something we call remodeling, which means turning over? In a sense, we're just sort of adding on to the bone over time. So if you kind of think about an immature bone, it's going to have quite a bit of cartilage. In a younger child before puberty, and the way those bones are growing is you're getting new bones along the end. And we do have some of that turnover where some of the old bone is getting removed, but new bone is being added on. What you really see happening, if you think of the cartilage shown in white, and as that bone is getting older, the cartilage is being replaced by bone. Now at the end, there's a small region of cartilage, and this is called the growth plate or the epithelial growth plate. In puberty, our bones are not only getting longer, they're also getting thicker. So bones can grow here and they can grow this way. But at the end of the day, you've got these mature bones. That's really happening during puberty, and of course we continue to accrue bone density into our young adult years. The way you can tell how old somebody's bone is, though, is really looking at the growth plate and seeing if it has stopped or not. So here's a more in detail look at what I was just talking about with looking at the growth plates. So if you think about assessment of growth and development, we've been talking about growth charts all along. We will still do that even for teenagers. We usually do that until they're 20 years old. So we're taking serial or repeated measurements of height and weight. We're plotting it on growth charts. We're still looking at height for age, weight for age, and BMI for age. What problems might this alert you to? So we spent so much time talking about red flags, especially when we think about infants. With an older child and teenagers, you know, you're not going to see typically sudden changes. But you would have established a pretty consistent percentile by this time. And if you see changes, it might alert you to some type of physical problem, especially if weight was changing, It might alert you to problems with excessive weight gain, and you might be worried about overweight or obesity. It's certainly going to tell you if you're in a growth spurt or not, although that's all sort of made relative in the growth charts as you compare it to other people. But they're still very relevant and important to look at. If you wanted to know someone's skeletal age, you do that by taking an X-ray of the left hand. So this is the same person, and you're seeing the X-ray of their left hand as they go from 7 years old to adulthood at 18 and a half, at least physiological adulthood. And again, it's these important sex hormones that are changing so much during adolescence that's forcing the closure of that growth plate. So you see more space between the bones at these younger ages, but as the bones grow and get longer and get thicker, there's less space. That cartilage becomes entirely replaced with bones. And by the time you get to this age, bone growth and certainly changes in height is going to cease or stop. So sometimes it's easier to understand normal growth and development by thinking about what happens when there's a problem or some type of growth disorder. So if you see someone who is clearly shorter than you would expect, they have some type of pathological or disease-driven cause of short stature, that is usually because something has changed hormonally. An endocrine disorder would be some problem with hormones, especially if growth hormone wasn't sufficient. That would cause someone not to grow normally. We tend to see shorter stature in some of our genetic chromosomal defects like Down syndrome or Prader-Willi we've already talked to. These two children have something called skeletal dysplasia. It's very clear that they're not experiencing normal growth. You can also have it on the other end of the spectrum. So what happens when you have someone who's extremely tall? Usually when you see that, so that would be of course this man here and this man here, they had some type of growth hormone secreting tumor, often on the tumors on the pituitary gland. So excess growth hormone is happening. This here is talking about adolescents with precocious puberty. So that means starting puberty at a very young age. They can end up with compromised adult height. So because of they're going through puberty young, they have all this, estrogen and androgen at early years, and the growth plates are going to close up too soon and can cause those problems. Here you can kind of notice that the bones in his face are quite large. It's something called acromegaly. If you have already gone through puberty, but you have excess growth hormone after puberty, your bones are going to get thicker. And that's what you see here. That could also happen in the hands as well, not just the face. So those are abnormal. Normal development, and now we're talking about psychosocial. Teenagers are sort of known for their sometimes challenging psychosocial development, although this is just a normal part of growing up. The next phase is adulthood. So in this sort of final stage where we're still not quite adults, adolescents are certainly developing their personal identity, and they have usually more freedom to express that. I, of course, see plenty of adults now with purple hair, so it might not be the best example, but having a stronger personal identity is important and normal. Developing their own moral and ethical value system, maybe separate from their parents. Thinking about, what might be of interest to a teenager, maybe more um, environmental awareness or even a different political view than their parents might have. Feelings of self-esteem and self-worth can be complicated. Certainly we want that for all of our adolescents, but there is, of course, a lot of pressure and a lot of worry about peer opinion. At this age, you can probably remember people asking you all the time, what do you want to be? Where do you want to go to school? Sometimes teenagers will have those visions and aspirations. Of course, not everybody will, because you're still quite young. Teens are also known for their poor judgment at times, and there's a reason for that. It's not necessarily poor parenting or the fault of the teen. It really has to do with normal brain and cognitive development. So we know that our brain is a pretty amazing organ, and there's different regions or parts of the brain that control certain behavior and characteristics. So the part of the brain that does regulate behavior and emotion, and the part of the brain that interprets perception and evaluates risk and reward is still developing during puberty. So teenagers are known for sometimes being very emotional. I feel like girls get a bad rap for this, although I think both girls and boys are susceptible to this. The evaluation of risk and reward, that's probably something boys maybe get a little more accused of, where they have poor judgment and engage in risky behaviors that can be harmful. Another thing that's sort of going on in terms of their brain development is that extra sensitivity to what peers think of them. Again, this is true of most teens, and it's not necessarily just kind of a social learned behavior. It has to do with cognitive development, and being hyper aware, especially in the context of maybe still developing self-esteem and things like that. I'm not going to show you the YouTube video. It's a young woman sort of talking about the teenage brain. It's kind of short and entertaining, so feel free to watch that if you're interested. Now, puberty, a lot of aspects of puberty are very obvious and visible to other people. And when you're especially worried about what your peers think of you, this can be really difficult and actually impact someone's behavior. So what's also interesting about this is it often impacts females and males very differently. So in females, early puberty is associated with increased mood disorders, delinquency, dropout rates, and pregnancy. So basically, early puberty, so thinking about having that before your peers do, especially if you start getting your period, or you have that breast development, which is usually pretty obvious to other people and nobody else is going through that. It seems to have a negative impact on a lot of girls. For boys, it's actually the opposite, where if a boy starts to have a deeper voice and get taller and put on more muscle mass, this is generally viewed as a positive thing and might increase his social status and self-esteem. And then, boys don't get off the hook, right? If a boy or a male is delayed and he goes through puberty late, that can feel bad, right? You don't want to be different from your peers. You don't want to be the smallest person or the person that doesn't have a lot of muscle mass yet. And so boys might be more likely in that case to do things that would get them attention, or become more antisocial. So kind of shifting away from some of those conversations and thinking about what our typical adolescent is eating. So far, we haven't had a lot of positive things to say about the average American diet. And that's not going to change in adolescence, unfortunately. So we know that adolescents have inadequate intake of folate, vitamins A, B6, C, and E, iron, zinc, magnesium, phosphorus, and calcium. The list has gotten longer. So why might that be? Why do we see more deficiencies in this age group? It's really related to higher needs because of puberty and growth spurts. So not meeting those higher needs. And of course, as a young person has more independence to choose their own foods, they might be more likely to consume the less healthy choices and the more processed foods. My kids like Home Alone. So if you ever saw that movie, it's Kevin shocked that adolescents are not meeting the dietary guidelines. Ha ha ha, right? So we know that adolescents do not meet the dietary guidelines or the MyPlate recommendations on average. If you equate this to food groups, not consuming a lot of dairy, so calcium, D, riboflavin, vitamin A, not having enough specifically whole grains and fiber, which is going to result in, of course, not having enough fiber, but also a lot of the B vitamins, the magnesium, sometimes the iron, and not having enough fruits and vegetables and getting all those good antioxidants and fiber and other important nutrients. We know that about 32% of calories come up from fat, not so far off the recommendations, but generally too high in saturated fat. About 21% of the diet comes from added sugars, and we're really supposed to keep that number under 10. So definitely too much sugar. If you think about what's driving these numbers, you need to be thinking about, well, they're not eating dairy, whole grains, and fruits and vegetables. So what are they eating? Very similar to our pre-adolescents. So a lot of salty snacks foods, think about chips, crackers, ready-to-eat cereals, which can often be high in sugar, and soft drinks, which only have sugar. We also see adolescents frequently eating away from home. Again, if they have the freedom to choose, they might not be making the best choices. So as we move along in the semester, it kind of always amazes me at how fast it goes by. So we started out, of course, talking about pregnancy and babies and kids and kind of preteens. So here we are in the teenage years. And as I mentioned, this is the last phase before we come into adulthood. So what's going on in terms of health consequences related to diet and exercise as a teenager? We're really starting to think about setting them up for these years, which for hopefully most of us will span a very long time. So these are not teenagers, right? These are conceivably not so healthy adults. So what can we do here so we do not look like this during our golden years? Let's first think about what's driving these diets or these food choices, because we know on average they're not going to be healthy. So we know that gender, ethnicity, and parental income do influence dietary intake and dietary quality. That was true for younger people, and it's of course true for older teenagers. We also know that advertising and marketing is alive and well. And certainly, especially when you're sensitive to your peers and media, you're going to be aware of sort of what's cool and what's not cool. Marketers know this. So they know who our young people tend to idolize and value, and they will pay them ridiculous amounts of money to promote their products. So it's a really difficult battle. You know, we talked about some of these little kid stuff and how easily kids get drawn into that. And of course, marketers are very intelligent, and they know what's going to motivate a little bit of an older consumer. We also have other sort of social things. So teenagers tend to be very busy, more independent as they should be. They don't have a lot of time to sit down and eat, especially family meals become more difficult. We talked about kids needing frequent meals and frequent snacks as we get older and we have less time. That now turns into not eating meals, but maybe kind of snacking too much. We tend to eat away from home more and eat even more fast food as we get into the teen years. We tend to drink not so much milk and juice and rely more on soft drinks as we get older. More eating meals in front of the television and certainly snacking at night. These can all lead to not so good diets. Some teenagers decide to become vegetarian even if their families are not. Right now, about 4% of adolescents report following a vegetarian diet. And there can be good and bad reasons for this. Sometimes if it's more of a family choice, that can be influenced by culture or religion. Sometimes people are interested in, sustainability and animal welfare, and that might be a driver to eat less meat. Occasionally, it's going to be because of health benefits. Sometimes it's a less healthy reason. So I've certainly noticed this maybe a little bit more with females, but um, kind of an excuse to not eat things, to restrict food or restrict calories, which can be a concern about developing eating disorders. Sometimes it's just to assert their independence. I actually was a vegetarian in high school. Um, Probably mostly to irritate my lovely mother um, and not eat anything that she wanted to cook, which horrifies me now that I know how much work it is. But that's what you'll find, and you guys know you can be perfectly healthy vegetarian and vegan if it's carefully planned, but vegetarian and vegan do not always equate to healthy. All of these foods here, are vegan and certainly wouldn't be considered healthy. How much energy or calories do adolescent needs? It's going to vary, of course. So how active are they? What's their basal metabolic rate, which is largely genetically determined? Where are they in puberty? So what is their biological age? Because males have a greater increase in height, weight, and lean mass and a higher basal metabolic rate, they need more calories than females for the most part. Of course, activity level needs to be factored into that statement. In terms of protein, we need protein to maintain our lean body mass, especially our muscle mass. Especially, boys and girls actually are putting on new lean body mass, and that's going to be very much driven by protein. So a little bit higher than an adult. So instead of 0.8, 0.85 grams per kilogram. If a teenager is not meeting those needs, maybe they're being very restrictive or not having the best planned vegetarian or vegan diet, that can impact linear growth or changes in height, especially if they're earlier in the puberty. It can delay sexual maturation and reduce your lean body mass. So important to meet those requirements during this growth spurt time. In terms of other nutrients, carbohydrates is the exact same as it is for adults. At least 130 grams to prevent ketosis and about 45 to 65% of calories. For fiber, we're about the same, 26 grams for girls, 31 for boys. So that really doesn't change from adolescents compared to adults. For fat, we certainly need fat in our diet. We need all those essential fats. We don't go low fat unless there's a medical reason in an adolescent. The recommendation for saturated fat is the same. We know that heart disease can start at this young age, and so we want to be thinking about prevention. And I'm showing you down here healthy fats. So instead of saturated fats, thinking about those omega-3s and monounsaturated fats, all that good stuff. I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about calcium and vitamin D than I have for some of our other groups, because this is such an important time for bone. We really need to be thinking about calcium for our teenagers. About half of peak bone mass is put on during adolescence, and females tend to accrue less than males. So if you think about what that means, right? So you're accruing bone mass because as you get older, you start to lose mass. So if you haven't accrued a lot during this really important time, you're going to have problems later down the road. That's why the DRI for calcium is highest, 1,300 milligrams during the teen years, but the average is lower than that, below the DRI. So we really have to be thinking about future bone health and what might be impacted. Vitamin D is a common problem in really all age groups, including adolescents. So we know that blood levels have declined over the years, especially of darker skin, which blocks the conversion from sunlight. So we do tend to recommend supplements for high-risk groups. So if you think about that, what does that mean? High risk would be teens of color, and those who aren't meeting the recommendations. Think about someone who maybe doesn't drink milk or soy milk or something like that. Iron is important. They have higher iron needs because they're growing really rapidly during that final growth spurt. We're seeing increases in blood volume, same thing we talked about, not as much as during pregnancy, but still happening. Girls are starting to lose blood every month when they start menarche or start having their periods. So in females, our iron needs are the highest after we start menarche. It goes up to 18 milligrams, which is even higher than what males need. For males, their iron needs are greatest during their active growth spurt. The physical activity recommendations change a bit. We do want our teenagers to be physically active every day. We say that about everybody. We still want 60 minutes or more. The new part, of course, is thinking about muscle and bone strengthening activities at least 3 days a week. So that's not a recommendation we have for our younger groups, but we do start including that during the teen years. Not shockingly, we aren't achieving our physical activity goals, and we do see disparities or differences by race. So here's who's getting vigorous activity. So the higher the number, the better. For all grouped together, it is white non-Hispanic kids who are meeting the physical activity recommendations. Males, you can see generally are higher than females, so more active. And again, in all groups, it's the white kids who get the most, and the Black non-Hispanic, especially females, who are really falling short of the physical activity recommendations. I'm going to start thinking about what problems we might see in the nutrition world. How do we screen for that? And how do we assess that? So screening is kind of the quick and dirty look for problems, and if you find them, go down for a more intensive assessment. So all adolescents should receive annual health screening and guidance. They should go in for a yearly physical consistently. In terms of nutrition, that type of screening should Continue to look at height, weight, BMI, and think about the growth charts. Those are important anthropometric measures, so measures you can do on the body that give you an indication of someone's nutritional status. B is for biochemical, so things that you might measure in blood or urine that will give you a sense of someone's nutrition status. If there's a strong family history, we might already be looking at blood lipid levels. Certainly iron status could be important in this age group. For clinical problems, one thing we would start to be thinking about is disordered eating and worried about development of eating disorders, which can happen at this age. D for diet, thinking about what they're intaking and whether or not that's adequate, or if there's something they're consuming in excess, like sugar or saturated fat. And the last part of a thorough screening and assessment would be just environmental factors. So is there any food insecurity or barriers to getting healthy food or access to food? This can be many things that you might think about. So I always like to remember assessment by A, B, C, D, and E. It helps me organize my thoughts. And just quickly to remind you, A is for anthropometric measures, B is for biochemical, C is for clinical, D is for diet, and E is for environmental. So nutrition screening should be brief. Screening is sort of quick and dirty. Dietary assessment. We can use food frequency questionnaires, although those are usually used in research. Most often with an adolescent, we would do a 24-hour recall. So tell me everything you've eaten in the past 24 hours. If they're in for maybe more intensive intervention, they might keep a food diary or food records, either in person or online, or using an app. And then if you do have any nutritional risk, you might want to think about further assessment and counseling. So here's a picture of a teenager talking with a nutrition professional. This can be a tricky population to work with. I had some experience working with teenagers. If you think, why would a nutrition educator be seeing a teenager? It's often going to be, maybe some type of deficiency, like an iron deficiency. I used to see teenagers for weight management. Certainly, if someone had an eating disorder, they'd be working with a nutrition professional. But now we have to kind of make some decisions. So they're not quite adults, but they're not quite kids. When you're working with them, do you talk to the teen or the parent? And then when you are talking to the teenager, how do you engage them? Sometimes it's really hard to connect with someone who's having a different life experience than you are. And you want to be thinking about, what's motivating and what's driving them. So I'll just kind of answer some of these questions. When I worked with teenagers, I like to talk to both, usually the teenager first by themselves, so they felt free to share information without their parents talking for them or maybe judging them. I don't exclude the parents, however, especially because parents still have a lot of control, right? They have the money, they buy the groceries. A lot of times they're preparing the food. So we usually do need involvement from both, although I did have the most success talking to them separately most of the time. In terms of engaging them, I certainly had plenty of not very engaged teenagers in my day. When you're talking about nutrition, you're probably talking about food, and most people like to talk about food. You also want to think about, what did you like when you were a teenager? Most teenagers want to be treated not like a kid, but more like an adult. So that would be really important to kind of build mutual respect and trust. And then what's going to be important to know about them, they're probably not as motivated by health as an older person. They're probably more concerned about kind of immediate things, like being good at sports or having energy or looking a certain way, not necessarily, their family risk of diabetes or something like that. So if you ever are involved in nutrition interventions for this age group, think about how important it is would be to get off to a good start. So that initial component of a session, where you're really trying to get to know the adolescent, trying to make it personal for them and include them. So what do they care about? What are their concerns? What do they think they need to improve or change if they do want to do that? Also remember that, especially in a first session, everything's going to be new to them. So sort of giving an overview of, what's going to happen, what are the events, what's the content, to show respect and not overly intimidate anyone. This is true for adults and adolescents, involving them in the decision-making process. So you don't just tell somebody what to do. You come up with strategies and goals that are more driven by the person, not you telling them. Along that same line, encouraging the adolescent to suggest ways to change. Usually if something comes from within rather than being told, it's more likely to happen. And then another really important one is having, one or two goals. If there's too many or they're too ambitious, you can really set someone up to feel like they failed. So being realistic and trying to do a really good job at a smaller number of things tends to be a good strategy. So I'm learning all about technology right now, shifting to more online classes. Most teenagers are interested in technology. Of course, most communication happens via text. Um, YouTube is a popular way to sort of watch and get information, and that, of course, is not the only way anymore. Facebook, I've been told, is for old people and not so popular with teenagers. Twitter, I'm not so sure about. I think Snapchat is probably more popular. Now, teenagers don't necessarily want to engage with older people. This is how they engage with their peers. But you have to recognize at the very least that they will get information from social media and probably need some help in recognizing what's good information and what's bad information. If you're working with this population, because of what I just said, you have to be aware of what's happening online and in social media. And if you want to be getting your messages out there, it's a good opportunity to spread valid and evidence-based information in a fun and engaging way, to combat a lot of the misinformation that they tend to be exposed to. So thinking about messaging for youth, right? They're young, so we're mostly focused on prevention. But prevention is tough. It's tough for anybody, especially teens who are very present orientated. Again, that's part of their brain development and their ability to kind of assess risk. They're not thinking that they're going to get lung disease or diabetes. So you have to find another way that might motivate them, like appearance or having a healthy weight or having lots of energy or being good at sports. I already mentioned that. I also need to make sure I mention that this is a time when boys and girls are prone to eating disorders. So making these things be about health is critical, not just being thin, for example. So, what can parents do to help? As again, they're gatekeepers. They usually buy the food. They might not feel like it, but they're still role models. And the fact that teenagers really eat a lot based on availability and convenience, you can use to your advantage. So if you can make healthy food easy and somewhat appealing, they are going to be more likely to consume it. So these examples, I love these salads in the jars. I think they're very attractive and kind of fun to eat. A little bit less than, just eating a salad. This is an example of just being really organized and having some good options that someone can just grab and eat or reheat in the microwave. They're going to be much more likely to make those choices and maybe not rely on fast food or processed food. Schools are still an important place for nutrition education and programming. We're still kind of thinking about school lunch, but also learning about health in classes, continuing physical education, thinking about school food service, where a lot of adolescents will still get a lot of food, maybe having more involved health services. I know I once did an internship at a high school where there was actually a registered dietitian on staff to talk to the students and do counseling for free. Remember that faculty and staff are also role models and trying to provide opportunities to be healthy for them as well. Um, we aren't known necessarily for our good healthy habits. So above and beyond just a school, think about an entire integrated community where there's easy access to places to be active and access to healthy foods that people are able to purchase, all part of public health. So thank you for your attention. I would also encourage you to read the chapter that goes along with this section.